Hi, my name is Paul Richardson. I'm a general practitioner or GP in the Greater Manchester area, and I'm also a clinical debrief tutor for the third year medical students at Manchester University, which I'll get into more later on. So what's the purpose of this video? Well, the title of the assignment, as you saw at the start, is the formation of my identity as a reflective educator. As such, I plan to discuss who I am in more detail, where I came from, and what key points in my life journey I believe have developed me as a reflective educator. I don't think you can educate without having learned first, so I'll look at some key learning events for me before focusing on the educator aspect of it. I will then finish by mentioning about what the future may hold for me. During this video, I will reference some literature with this assignment to give a more well-rounded evidence base of reasoning for some of my assertions and reasoning. Thankfully, I found that I've naturally used some effective teaching strategies without much conscious reflection. However, looking into the literature not only backs up some styles which I found useful, but also deepens my knowledge and gives me more of a basis to assess and develop my educational style further. As this is a YouTube video, I use this sound to indicate when I've cited another's work, and I'll put all of my references in the description below. You never stop learning, and no time are you most active as a learner as during childhood. That would be quite a large topic for me to cover, so I'm going to put that aside and focus on adult experiences where I became more aware of my learning styles and I started to appreciate education more. One of the most significant events came during my college years at Runshaw College. Not knowing what I wanted to do in school, I thought about going into economics and I enjoyed the subject. However, on talking to people in the field, they gave me quite a negative impression about economics, mainly a lack of job prospects. My economics tutor told me that if he could go back, he would have studied law instead. I looked into this, being quite impressionable at 15. I thought it was a good idea, so I studied law, psychology, government politics and maths at college, with a view to going on to study law and becoming a barrister. However, during the first year of college, I realised that I was pursuing someone else's dream. I had less interest in the practicalities of law than I initially thought. This gave me significant food for thought. I spent many hours contemplating what I was good at, not so good at, and where my life would take me. This process has been described before by Atkins and Murphy in 1993. There's 3 stages of reflection, including an uncomfortable feeling, in this setting going down a path I was unhappy with, critical analysis of it, so my time contemplating my current predicament, and then a development of a new perspective, so in this case acknowledging my strengths and weaknesses and looking into a better long-term plan for me. At the end of my first year at college, I achieved a B in law, a D in psychology and an E in government and politics. This was far below what I thought I could achieve. I remember the day I actually got my papers back and discussed with my psychology tutor about my marks. He told me that I'd actually got all the correct answers, but the way I'd worded it, I was only getting half marks for each question. I realised that I had more of a science-based mind than arts. Although this was not news to me, I found the sciences a lot easier. It dawned on me that the gravity of how much my future could depend on my current success and my grades. Although I'm sure I could have gotten my grades higher, it was going to be a significant uphill struggle, and this could be the way for my whole life if I continued down a similar path. I therefore had a meeting with the head of college and he allowed me to start college again. I went on to do 3 sciences as well as completing my maths A-level and getting into medical school. In medical school, we were first introduced to reflective writing, having to write pieces on encounters we had each year. I found formal reflecting a struggle at this stage of my life. Being so concerned about the knowledge part of the curriculum, reflection felt like a luxury I didn't have time to involve myself with, and something I could consider at a later date. I managed some poor quality, shallow, reflective pieces, which were passable, but didn't give me too much to dwell on and didn't broaden my understanding of or thinking at the time. I look back now on this as a missed opportunity to develop my reflective practice at an earlier age. During foundation year training, we also had to complete some reflections, but again, these were mainly descriptive pieces which I didn't particularly focus on at the time. When I went into GP training, the amount of reflective pieces required went up significantly. However, in this setting, we had a clinical and an educational supervisor. In my first year, I discussed a basic reflective structure with my educational supervisor, but it wasn't until my second year that I really started to delve into the pros and cons of reflective practice, in particular around my consultations. This is where I started to use the literature more. Two models in particular I found useful was the what, so what, and now what model by Rolfe et al. 2001 to help structure my reflections, and S.M.A.R.T objectives, which I'll come to in a moment. Rolfe's model of reflective writing helped give me a simple reflective structure that was easy to remember and work through. Instead of simply describing what happens as I had done in the past, I was able to set some space for description, but then also some space for why what happened was important, what it meant to me and the wider impact it might have. I then would also consider how this might change things in the future. What I found over time during GP training is that even with this structure, I initially stuck to old ways, spending most of my time writing descriptions. However, as time went on, I was able to write less in the descriptive part and much more in the reflective part, delving into why each piece, whether a patient contact, professional discussion or other topic, was important, how it could be interpreted, what it meant to me, why it was important, what different people could interpret, and the list goes on. This evolution of my writing also occurred with my plans at the end. Initially, I'd write something vague, often which couldn't or would be difficult to measure and would be open-ended. A typical example would be, I plan to increase my exposure to X. Although not wrong, you could do this with good intentions. It wasn't something I could easily come back to or that I could evidence that I had done. When I was introduced to S.M.A.R.T objectives, it initially seemed a little lengthy for a plan, which I would usually prefer to keep quite concise. But actually, as I started to use it, I realised how important it was whilst keeping the plan concise. So going through the S.M.A.R.T objectives. So first you've got specific, which is making sure what you are doing is not vague and nebulous, but a particular goal you want to achieve. You have measurable. So can I or someone know when it is done and can it be measured? Achievable. Can I actually accomplish this goal, as setting goals that are too lofty can be demoralising to not complete, but also are often not of use if we will never actually achieve them. Realistic. On a similar line to achievable, is this goal possible or even appropriate to your level or role? And finally, but most importantly to me, is timely. This is something I would sometimes avoid or forget in my plans, trying not to pin myself down to any particular goal, as I felt unsure when I would achieve my normal goals. But part of this was due to their vague nature. By making the plans more specific and achievable, the timing element seemed more natural and sensible, giving me more impetus to actually go on and achieve the goals. I found I could then write about how I completed my goals at a later date, giving the reflective piece more meaning and a feeling of completion. This S.M.A.R.T mnemonic was first described by George T. Doran in his piece, There's a Smart Way to Write Management's Goals and Objectives, in the November 1981 issue of Management Review, but initially had a signable as the A of the mnemonic, as it was referring to teams, where I'm using it in a personal context, so a signable is not as relevant. As I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of pieces to write in GP training, on average 2 a week for 3 years, so I found these simple steps suited me best. However, sometimes there were events that were more detailed or even more meaningful to me. To try and get more out of the reflection and ensure I cover all of the appropriate points, I would often turn to Gibbs' reflective cycle in 1988, which was more in-depth, having 6 steps. That was description, so what happened, feelings, what was I was thinking or feeling at the time, evaluation, what was good and bad about the event, analysis, making sense of what happened in the event, conclusion, what else could I have done, and finally action plan, which I could take either similar to the S.M.A.R.T objectives above, or alternatively If I were to come across this situation again, what would I do next time? So far I've talked about my journey as a learner. Now I'd like to move on to my journey as a reflective educator. Arguably through involved education with my peers, we educated each other as we learned with group discussions. However, I'm going to focus more on my years since graduating as a doctor. Part of being a doctor is educating others. It is actually a JMC requirement, that is the General Medical Council, our statutory regulator. In their document that's updated regularly, Good Medical Practice, it states you should be prepared to contribute to teaching and training doctors and students. Most teaching was informal, as the medical students were placed on medical wards for a few hours at a time, and I would typically not know they were going to be there. I would happily spend time with them, going through patients' histories or examinations, discussing what the diagnosis was and how it could be managed. At that young age, I did not pay much attention to my style. It was simply a conversational style approach, quizzing or probing their knowledge, and if they didn't know, I would simply tell them the answer. My feedback was generally positive, likely due to my informal and friendly nature, and I was happy with what I was doing. The main thoughts I would have would be around avoiding events I didn't find useful. An example of this was being on a ward round and being asked questions that were well above my understanding at the time as a medical student. Not only did I find this education by humiliation approach unhelpful, but it made me feel uncomfortable and inferior at the time. It is only now I can see how pushing students out of their comfort zone into a zone of proximal development, as described by Vygotsky in his paper published in 1978, seems to achieve the best results, where with assistance they can develop new learning without pushing them into the complete unknown, where they may feel uncomfortable as I did and learn little to nothing, having no knowledge of the topic. It wasn't until the later years of GP training when I really started to reflect on my own educational style. I was focusing on how to explain diagnosis, investigations and treatments to patients, and we would work in small groups to role play these, where we would feed back to each other. Performance and ability varied wildly, and at that stage between different trainees, I remember we had one who particularly struggled early on with explaining. I then took the time to consider my feedback approach that would be most beneficial to him as well as others. Feedback on performance is such a key element to education and is often quite a difficult time for some students. I like a very direct approach, what I could improve on, but I am aware that others would not take this style well. I then looked into feedback styles. One I found particularly useful was Pendleton's 1984 model of feedback. In a group setting, I would ask the individual I was giving feedback to what they thought they did well, then ask the rest of the group, which included myself, what we thought they did well, before moving on to what they thought they could improve on, focusing on the constructive nature of feedback rather than simply giving criticisms, and again asking the rest of the group for some constructive feedback. After completing GP training, I took on the role of teaching GP trainees in the year below about the clinical skills exam, the final exam for GP trainees. To do this, I first had to complete a 2-day course learning about different teaching theories, as well as some extracurricular reading. I hadn't previously appreciated how broad a topic andragogy is. I found it ironic how I worked myself through Luft's and Ingham's Johari's window, written in 1955, as I learnt about the window itself in the session. I went from unconsciously incompetent, where I knew nothing about the window or many of the theories, to consciously incompetent, where I was more aware the theories existed, but still unused for me, to consciously competent, where I was actively using a lot of these theories in sessions that I was running. I then shadowed a session focusing on the educator rather than the topic at hand. I found this fascinating. We had worked through the facilitative style of teaching as described by Herod in 1975 in our preparation for this teaching session, but it was great to see it in action. When the students had time allocated to complete certain tasks in buzz groups, as described by Bellon and Blank in 1992, what impressed me the most in our discussion afterwards was how easily he linked his teaching style back to the literature, which shows that his teaching was embedded in evidence-based practice. I've worked as a clinical debrief tutor with the University of Manchester for the last 2 years. This involves weekly meetings with the third year medical students to discuss cases they have seen typically that last week. I use a facilitative style I've developed over the years. Depending on how long we take discussing these cases, we often also get opportunities to do some extra learning with a focus towards preparation to practice. This has been a fantastic opportunity to develop my own style of teaching. In particular, I've been able to look into the literature and apply it to my teaching, experimenting with different approaches. One theory was around learning styles, and I was conscious that my style so far has been based around what I have been taught and what I have found useful. However, I was becoming increasingly aware of the differences between students and how they learn, from personal reading of learning styles to discussion and feedback from students about what they found useful and not useful, and how some students would find one topic useful where others wouldn't. I found I was more towards the theory and pragmatic practitioner elements as described by Honey and Mumford in 1986, whereas I'm aware others may be towards the activist and reflective style. I therefore included more elements to engage these. An example of this was when I asked the students to draw out the anatomy of the head to develop a list of differential diagnoses of headache, which would engage the activists of the group. This takes us up to the present. My official role as an educator remains as a clinical debrief tutor. However, I am getting more involved with the University of Manchester, where I plan to run workshops at our clinical debrief conference about gamification of learning and its uses in education. I'm also using courses such as this one to further develop my educational style and foundation of knowledge, reading more into transformative learning as described by Mesereau in 1991, and how I can apply that to my educational approach. I continue to reflect on my practice and try new techniques and styles to make adjustments and improvements for the modern student, so hopefully any student finds my encounters engaging and beneficial. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this YouTube video. As I mentioned at the start, you'll find all of my references in the description below.